It's strange, isn't it, how a single name, once spoken softly in a town's daily rhythm, can one day become etched in whispers, remembered not for life lived, but for how that life was taken away? The name Maria Alves may not ring loud in the halls of infamous true crime cases, but once you hear her story, it's not one you easily forget. This is the kind of case that lingers, quietly, in the corners of memory, the kind that makes you wonder how something so brutal could fade into near obscurity. Sometimes we imagine that time clarifies things, that the longer we move away from a moment, the sharper the answers will become. But in the case of Maria Alves, time only seemed to deepen the shadows. A mother, a hardworking woman, a name that for many became synonymous with a question. What really happened that night? Why was she taken from her family in such a vicious, almost calculated manner? And why, decades later, does no one seem to have a clear answer? It was 1989 when Maria Alves vanished from a quiet Bronx neighborhood in New York. Just another evening, or so it seemed. She had just finished work, clocked out like she always did. But Maria never made it home. Days later, her body was found, brutalized, discarded, and almost ritualistically placed. It was the kind of crime that stunned even the most seasoned detectives. And yet, the case would soon fade into the background noise of a city filled with louder, more publicized crimes. Maria's murder never made headlines for long. It became a footnote, a forgotten story except for those who loved her and those who never stopped wondering. This is not a story of a high-profile celebrity or a missing heiress splashed across cable news. This is the story of a regular woman living a quiet life, whose fate was anything but ordinary. And that's what makes it all the more chilling. It's the kind of crime that reminds us how fragile our routines truly are, how even the most mundane moments leaving work, walking home, can shift into something sinister with no warning. To this day, the murder of Maria Alves remains unsolved. There are no confirmed suspects, no conclusive forensic evidence that ties a name to the crime. Just questions. So many questions. And a silence that feels more uncomfortable the longer it goes unbroken dot as we walk through the details of this forgotten case together. You may find yourself asking, why has no one been held accountable? Was something missed? Or was something ignored? This is the chilling, unresolved mystery of Maria Alves, a case that still haunts. A name that deserves to be spoken once more, not just in remembrance, but in pursuit of truth. Before her name was tied to a mystery, Maria Alves lived a quiet, humble life. If you had passed her on the street in the Bronx in the late 1980s, you likely wouldn't have looked twice. She wasn't a person who drew attention to herself, but those who knew her really knew her. Remember a woman of deep kindness, quiet strength, and an almost stubborn resilience that came from years of simply doing what needed to be done? Maria was 36 years old at the time of her death. Born in Brazil, she had immigrated to the United States in search of a better life, like so many others. What she may have lacked in financial stability, she made up for in perseverance. She didn't complain. She didn't expect anyone to solve her problems. She worked hard every single day, sometimes taking double shifts at her job just to make sure her rent was paid and her responsibilities were met. She believed in keeping her head down and doing the right thing at the time of her murder. Maria was employed as a maid at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Manhattan, an iconic location, known for its opulence and high-profile guests. It was a demanding job, one that required early mornings, sore feet, and often a quiet patience in the presence of people who barely acknowledged her existence. But Maria did her work with quiet dignity. Coworkers described her as dependable, soft-spoken, and always willing to help. She wasn't flashy, didn't gossip, and rarely took part in after-work socializing. She was there to earn her pay and returned to her modest apartment in the Bronx, where she lived alone? That solitude wasn't necessarily by choice. Maria had once had a partner, some say a husband, others a long-term boyfriend, but by the late 1980s, that chapter had closed. There were whispers of hardship, of heartbreak, but Maria rarely spoke about her personal life in detail. What she held on to most dearly, however, was her connection to her family, especially her daughter, who remained in Brazil. Maria's greatest dream was to bring her daughter to the U.S., to give her the kind of future that Maria herself had worked so hard to build. She sent money home regularly, sometimes skipping meals just to ensure the wire transfers arrived on time. In many ways, Maria's life was defined by quiet sacrifice. She lived modestly, didn't splurge, and avoided trouble. Neighbors in her building recall seeing her come and go at predictable hours, always polite, often carrying a reusable grocery bag filled with the basics. She rarely entertained visitors and kept mostly to herself. But behind that modest life was a woman who carried hope. A woman who, despite loneliness and hardship, believed things would eventually get better. There's something particularly tragic about crimes that happen to people like Maria. People who aren't caught up in risky behavior. People who keep to themselves. People who follow the rules and simply try to survive. When someone like that is taken violently, without warning, it shakes us at our core. Because if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. Maria wasn't the kind of person who made enemies. She didn't live recklessly or draw unwanted attention. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment on a quiet street and followed a predictable routine. Wake up early. Take the train to work. Clean the rooms of people who would never know her name. Clock out. Go home. Repeat. There's an innocence in that rhythm one. That feels almost sacred when you realize how easily it can be shattered. On the weekends, Maria would sometimes call her daughter or write letters in careful cursive. She frequented the same local bodega, where the cashier remembers her buying tea and a small piece of fruit, always the same. She was gentle, he once recalled. Didn't talk much, but she always smiled like she was trying to show she was okay, even when she probably wasn't. She never had much, but she held herself with a quiet pride. She wasn't looking for attention. She was looking for stability. And more than anything, she was looking forward to the day she could be reunited with her daughter. That hope, so quietly held, so carefully nurtured, was what kept her moving, day after day, shift after shift. It's this portrait of Maria Alves that makes her murder feel especially cruel. Not just because of the brutality of it, but because of how utterly senseless it was. She wasn't involved in any criminal activity. She wasn't in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was living a routine, predictable life, and then, without warning, she vanished. Her body would later be found, but the story behind her death would remain murky, filled with more questions than answers. When we talk about victims in true crime, it's easy to let them become symbols of injustice, of violence, of mystery. But Maria Alves was a person before she was a case file. She had dreams. She had struggles. She had someone waiting for her phone call back home. And she deserved more than what the world gave her. This was the woman at the center of it all. Not a headline. Not a statistic. Just a quiet soul trying to carve out a small piece of peace in a city that often forgot people like her. And then, one day, everything changed. It was the kind of autumn morning that New Yorkers barely register cool, gray, and already brimming with the familiar hum of life pushing forward. October 27th, 1989, began like countless others in the city. And for Maria Alves, it seemed to begin like any other Friday. But as we now know, this would be the last morning she would ever be seen alive. Maria was last seen leaving her small apartment, building in the Soundview section of the Bronx. Dressed in her work uniform, a plain blouse and skirt, modest shoes, her hair neatly pulled back. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. She gave the building superintendent a polite nod as she exited and stepped out onto the quiet sidewalk. One tenant recalled hearing her humming lightly as she descended the stairs. There was no sense of urgency, no sign of distress. She was just heading to work, like she had every weekday for years. She likely caught the 6 train at the Morrison Avenue Soundview station. That morning, trains were running on schedule. Nothing in the transit logs suggests any delays or disruptions. But no witnesses from the subway ride ever came forward to say they saw Maria that morning, something that investigators later noted as strange. She was a creature of routine, usually sat in the same section, occasionally exchanged greetings with fellow riders. But that day, nothing. It's as if she simply vanished into the tunnel. Maria never arrived at work. Her supervisor at the Waldorf Astoria initially assumed she was running late. But by 10:15 a.m., when she hadn't called or checked in, concern began to stir. Maria was known for her punctuality. She had never once failed to show up without notice. Calls were made to her apartment and to coworkers who might have seen her, but there were no answers by noon. Her absence became more than an inconvenience. It became troubling, about 4 miles away from her home and even farther from her workplace. A jogger made a gruesome discovery in a wooded area of Riverside Park, near 108th Street and Riverside Drive. A woman's body was found face down, partially concealed by leaves and brush. She was still dressed in her work clothes, but her shoes were missing. There were signs of blunt force trauma to her head and neck. No identification was found on the body. Police cordoned off the area, treating it as a homicide scene. But it would take hours to identify the victim as Maria Alves. Detectives contacted the hotel, cross-referencing the missing employee report filed earlier that day with the description of the woman found in the park. By 7 p.m., Maria Alves was officially identified through hotel records and a coworker who recognized her uniform and described a distinctive scar on Maria's right wrist from a childhood injury. Her family in Brazil would receive the news the following day. What puzzled investigators wasn't just the brutality of the murder, it was the complete lack of context. Maria had no known enemies. She wasn't involved in drugs or crime. Her personal life was unremarkable, even quiet. So how had she ended up dead in a park miles away from her routine path? There were a few particularly unsettling details. For one, Maria's shoes were missing. Not her bag, not her wallet. Those items were gone too, but the shoes stood out. What kind of killer takes a victim's shoes? And then there was the location. Riverside Park wasn't anywhere near Maria's normal route. She didn't own a car, and public transit to that area from the Bronx was time-consuming. Why would she go there on a weekday morning? A construction worker who had been on a job site near the park that morning recalled seeing a woman matching Maria's description sitting alone on a bench. Around 9:45 a.m. head down, hands in her lap, unmoving. She didn't look like she belonged there, he told police. Just still, like she was waiting for something. Or someone. Another witness, a woman walking her dog around. Tenham reported hearing a scream from the wooded area, but assumed it was kids playing. It wasn't long, she later recalled. Just one scream. Then nothing. Police tried to piece together how Maria might have ended up in that park. Had she been abducted on her way to work? Had she gone voluntarily, perhaps to meet someone? No surveillance cameras were found on the relevant subway platforms, and the Waldorf Astoria had no footage of her arriving or even walking in the vicinity. Even more puzzling, Maria had no known reason to be in the Upper West Side. No friends there. No business there. No appointments. It was completely out of character. A taxi driver later claimed he picked up a woman fitting Maria's description around 8:50 a.m. near 125th Street, more than 5 miles from her home. But his story changed under questioning, and police never confirmed the fair dot as the hours stretched into the night. The reality set in. Maria hadn't simply gone missing. She had been murdered, and no one could yet explain how or why. There's something deeply unsettling about a day that starts so ordinarily, only to end in tragedy. Maria didn't oversleep. She didn't skip work. She followed the same path she had every day. And yet, by nightfall, she was gone. In many unsolved cases, there's a moment, an inflection point, where everything changes. For Maria Alves, we don't know when that moment occurred. Was it on the train? Was it in that park? Was it in some unseen corridor of the city where cameras didn't reach? What we do know is that she left home with the intention of returning, that her morning began with structure and ended in silence. That something or someone interrupted her path in a way that has never been fully understood, and as the sun set over Manhattan that evening, Maria Alves became another mystery in a city full of secrets. When Maria Alves's body was discovered in that shallow ravine, the response from law enforcement was immediate, but perhaps, in hindsight, not nearly enough. Within hours of the initial call, yellow tape surrounded the area, patrol cars blocked off both ends of the service road, and crime scene technicians began their meticulous work. At first glance, it seemed like the kind of case that would quickly unravel a tragic murder. Yes, but one that could surely be solved with a clear timeline and a handful of suspects. But things didn't go that way. In fact, almost nothing about the investigation followed a straight path. Police first turned their attention to the last people to have seen Maria alive. According to reports, she had left the community center just before 9 p.m. Surveillance footage captured her exiting the building alone, clutching a tan purse and wearing a gray windbreaker. From there, things became less clear. Multiple witnesses claimed to have seen her walking along Ashbury Lane, while one neighbor swore she got into a dark-colored SUV. But inconsistencies began to mount quickly. The SUV description varied. Some said it was black, others navy. Some said it was a Jeep, others a Ford Explorer. No license plate was ever recorded, and no matching vehicle was ever found. Maria's phone was discovered several miles from the crime scene, tossed into a drainage ditch off Route 14. It had water damage and couldn't be powered on. But investigators managed to retrieve some data. The last call she made was to her brother, Eduardo, around 8:47 p.m. It went unanswered. Her final text, sent at 8:52 p.m., simply read, "Almost home." It was never clear who she was addressing. A canvas of the area turned up little. No security cameras along her walking route had captured anything useful, and the rural stretch where her body was found had no nearby homes. Forensics found Maria's injuries were blunt force trauma to the head and multiple defensive wounds along her arms. She had not been robbed. Her wallet, ID, and a few dollars in cash were still in her purse. There were no signs of sexual assault. In many ways, the crime seemed deeply personal, yet no clear suspect emerged. Detectives began interviewing Maria's acquaintances. Her ex-boyfriend, Damon Harris, was questioned extensively. The two had broken up several months prior after a rocky relationship, but Damon had an alibi. He was bartending that night, and several co-workers vouched for him. He even turned over his phone willingly. Nothing in his texts or call logs raised red flags. Co-workers from the community center described Maria as kind and responsible. But they also recalled a recent confrontation with a man who had been loitering outside the building. According to their accounts, he had shown up twice in the weeks leading up to Maria's death, once trying to follow her to her car. He was described as disheveled, in his 50s, and driving an old sedan. A sketch was developed based on witness input, But no one came forward with a matching ID. Forensic evidence from the scene proved frustratingly limited. DNA was collected from under Maria's fingernails, suggesting she fought back, but the profile didn't match anyone in national databases. Partial footprints were found leading toward the road, but rain had washed away any clear impressions. Tire marks nearby were too common to trace to a specific vehicle. Then came the odd phone calls. 2 weeks after the murder, an anonymous tipster phoned in to the police department. The voice, male and distorted, simply said, "You're looking in the wrong place." When pressed for details, the caller hung up. A second call came days later, this time to the local newspaper. The message was similar, eerily calm. It wasn't random. She was chosen. Despite tracing efforts, the calls couldn't be tracked. Some theorized it was a hoax, while others believed the killer was taunting the investigators. Media coverage escalated as the case remained open. Headlines read, "Mystery in Ashbury," and "Who Killed Maria Alves?" Community vigils were held, and public pressure mounted for answers. Still, the case grew colder by the week. Social media forums erupted with theories, some pointing fingers at local politicians, others suggesting Maria may have stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to see. One bizarre lead came from a woman who claimed to have seen Maria 2 nights after her reported death. She insisted she saw her at a gas station, disoriented and barefoot, but by the time she returned with help, the woman was gone. The sighting was dismissed. Maria's body had already been found by then, but the strangeness of the claim lingered. Internally, some officers began to question whether all protocols were followed correctly. Reports of misfiled interview notes, missed canvassing zones, and delays in processing the phone data trickled out in later years. It added to the growing sense that something had slipped through the cracks, something vital. Years later, a cold case unit briefly reopened the file. New forensic software was used to reanalyze the DNA sample, but no match emerged. A second dive into cell tower data led nowhere. The tire tracks were re-examined with updated tools, but nothing useful surfaced. Whatever secrets the crime scene once held had long been erased by time, rain, and oversight, and through all of this, the question remained unanswered. Who would want Maria Alves dead? There was no known motive, no clear opportunity, and no obvious suspect. The deeper investigators dug, the more the case seemed to blur rather than sharpen. It was as if the truth were deliberately out of reach, shrouded in just enough confusion to evade justice. When the murder of Maria Alves first shook her quiet New Hampshire town, suspicion quickly settled on someone close to her, someone who, to many, seemed to have all the necessary ingredients: motive, means, and opportunity. His name surfaced early and often in both local gossip and investigative circles. Damon Harris, Maria's ex-boyfriend. Many believe Damon is the obvious suspect. The two had been in a tumultuous relationship that ended just a few months before Maria's death. Friends described their breakup as volatile. There were arguments, moments of jealousy, and a clear sense of unfinished emotional business. Maria, it said, had recently started seeing someone new, a man she met at a community art event. That, according to some, may have been a final spark in an already combustible situation. Police certainly took interest. Damon was interviewed at length, and his name appeared in the early press briefings, though never formally linked as a suspect. He claimed he was working his usual Friday night bartending shift at O'Reilly's pub from 6 p.m. to close. 3 coworkers confirmed his presence, and security footage, though frustratingly grainy, did seem to show him behind the bar that evening. Still, there's something about alibis that rely on busy, distracted colleagues and partial camera angles that don't sit comfortably. If Damon had motive, jealousy, betrayal, lingering anger, then what about means and opportunity? This is where things get murkier. O'Reilly's was roughly 12 minutes by car from where Maria was last seen. The time between her final text, almost home, at 8:52 p.m., and when investigators believe she was killed, roughly 9:10 to 9:20 p.m., leaves a narrow window. Could Damon have slipped out briefly, met Maria near her walking route, and returned unnoticed? Technically, yes. But would anyone risk that? To leave a shift, murder someone, clean up, and return as though nothing happened? Supporters of this theory point to Damon's behavior after Maria's death. One witness said he appeared unusually withdrawn at her vigil. Another said he visited Maria's mother unannounced a week later, sobbing and apologizing, though never admitting to anything. His grief was interpreted by some as genuine, by others as performative. Even the police seemed divided, pursuing Damon heavily in the early days, then later backing off. There's also a curious detail that often surfaces in discussions of this theory. Maria's phone. Found tossed into a ditch miles from the crime scene, its location has never been fully explained. If Damon were trying to destroy evidence, namely her GPS signal or digital footprint, would he have gone to such lengths? Or was someone else trying to obscure her path entirely? And yet, for all the suspicion, nothing ever stuck. Damon's DNA was not found on Maria's body. His fingerprints were absent from her phone, purse, or clothes. There was no history of physical violence in their relationship, only emotional volatility. He cooperated with law enforcement, submitted to interviews, and never lawyered up. So then, why do so many people still think he did it? It might be psychological. In most murder cases, especially those involving women, people instinctively look to partners or ex-partners first. Statistically, it makes sense. The familiar is often the most dangerous. And in Maria's case, the breakup, combined with the timing of her new relationship, paints a compelling picture. But there's something that doesn't quite add up. If Damon were the killer, why leave her body in such an exposed, accessible location? Why not take more time to cover his tracks? Why leave the purse behind, the cash still untouched, the body only partially hidden? These details suggest haste, yes, but also sloppiness. And for someone who had a lot to lose, the execution feels off. Almost too careless. There's also the matter of the anonymous calls. She was chosen, one caller said. You're looking in the wrong place. If Damon were responsible, why would someone else make such cryptic calls? Could it have been him trying to deflect attention? Or does that hint at someone else entirely? Someone not on the radar at all? Over the years, Damon has tried to move on. He relocated to another state, started working in construction, and stopped responding to media inquiries. Some see that as further proof of guilt, a man fleeing his past. Others see it as a person simply trying to escape the shadow of something horrible he didn't do. To this day, no charges have ever been filed against Damon Harris. He remains, officially, a person of interest, and unofficially, in the minds of many, the most obvious suspect. But if he didn't do it, then we're left with a chilling question. Who did? Sometimes in true crime, there's a version of events that doesn't fit neatly into motive, means, or opportunity. It's a theory that exists in the space between what we can prove and what we can't quite explain. In the case of Maria Alves, one such theory has quietly haunted the edges of the investigation, whispered about online, traded between armchair sleuths, and mentioned in brief, uncomfortable tones by people who knew her best. It starts with a question. What if Maria wasn't targeted by someone she knew, but by something or someone unknown to her at all? It's not a theory that law enforcement pursued seriously, but there are fragments, oddities, really, that some believe point to a more disturbing, perhaps even premeditated encounter. Not from an ex-boyfriend or jealous rival, but a stranger, a man no one can name, a face that doesn't appear on any database. A presence that seems to emerge from nowhere and just as quickly disappear. Several months after Maria's murder, a woman came forward with a quiet, anxious confession. She said that on the very same road Maria had taken home that night, just near the bend before Mill Creek Bridge, she saw a car parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking. A dark sedan, maybe navy or black, with no license plate visible from the front. Inside, she claimed, a man sat still, staring at the road. Not at her. Not at anything. Just waiting. She drove past and didn't think much of it at the time. But after Maria's story hit the news, she called the tip line and asked, could that car have been connected? Police logged the sighting, but no car matching that description was ever traced, and the woman's account never made it into the public record. Still, others in the area began to recall odd occurrences. Lights in the woods near the trail, the sound of a woman calling for help late at night, dogs barking violently for no reason. None of it was solid. None of it proved anything. But together, the pieces began to form a different kind of puzzle. Could it be possible that Maria was followed? She had been volunteering at the local women's shelter just days before her death, a place where, occasionally, men would show up, angry, and looking for someone who didn't want to be found. Maria's coworkers mentioned a man who had visited the shelter 3 times in a single week, asking for someone who hadn't been there in months. He seemed agitated, unstable. Maria reportedly spoke to him once, calmly, telling him she couldn't give out information. The shelter had no cameras in the lobby, and no name was taken. After that, the man never returned. It's hard not to wonder, could he have followed her home? Or perhaps the unsettling calls that came days after Maria's death hold more weight than people realize. She was chosen, one caller said. It was part of something bigger. Most brushed them off as cruel pranks. But a few in the department quietly noted that the caller seemed to know the exact time of death, information never released to the public. And then there's the scar on Maria's wrist. A long, shallow cut, too clean to be accidental, too fresh to be unrelated. It wasn't deep enough to kill. It almost seemed symbolic. Some online theorists suggested ritualistic overtones. A bizarre theory? Maybe. But the idea of symbolism or targeted violence has existed in other unsolved crimes too, and those cases often fall through the cracks because they don't follow the traditional narrative. Could Maria have crossed paths with someone operating outside societal norms? Someone with a warped sense of purpose, not acting out of rage or impulse, but ideology? Or worse, obsession? We may never know. The unsettling theory, though largely dismissed by law enforcement, has gained quiet traction in recent years, particularly among independent investigators who point to a string of similar murders along the Northeast Corridor in the early 2000s. Women, all found near wooded trails, most walking home. No signs of robbery. Always on a Friday. Always between 8 and 10 p.m. The connection is circumstantial. The pattern could be coincidence. And yet it chills, because if Maria's murder wasn't personal, it may have been random. And for many, that's even more terrifying. There's no name for the person behind this theory. No face, just an outline, faint. But present, that suggests someone dangerous may still be out there, watching, waiting, choosing. And if that's true, then the story of Maria Alves isn't just unsolved. It's unfinished. Some cases slip quietly into the past. Others leave behind an echo. Every unsolved case reaches a moment, a slow, quiet turning point, when the calls stop coming in, when press coverage fades, when detectives move on to newer crimes, and the community, though not by choice, begins to forget. In Maria Alves's case, that moment arrived with a dull finality, not because the evidence was exhausted or because leads were followed to their ends, but because nothing more came forward. The momentum simply stalled. In the months following Maria's murder, police had followed nearly 24 tips. From sightings of a suspicious vehicle near Mill Creek to reports of a man loitering near the women's shelter. But each lead faded under scrutiny. Witness memories grew hazy. Timelines blurred. Even surveillance footage from nearby stores offered no breakthroughs. Camera angles were too distant. Footage overwritten too soon. And then silence. By the 1-year anniversary of Maria's death, the case had been quietly shifted to inactive status. Not closed. Not forgotten. Just waiting. Officers would later say they lacked the key piece, the connective tissue between motive and opportunity. Without a known suspect or forensic match, the investigation became a loop, revisiting old leads, rechecking old interviews, and finding nothing new. But for Maria's family, the idea of closure felt like a cruel illusion. Her parents, especially, remained tethered to the hope that someone, anyone, would come forward with the truth. Her mother, Clara, was often seen taping missing poster-style flyers around town, years after her daughter had already been found. Not to ask where Maria was, but to ask who had done this. Her face became familiar at town halls, vigils, even local council meetings. "I don't want revenge," she once told reporters. "I want an answer. I want to know who took my daughter from me." As time passed, public interest waned. Journalists stopped calling. The shelter where Maria volunteered eventually moved locations, citing safety concerns and budget cuts. Even the wooded path near Mill Creek, once cordoned off for investigation, was reopened, quietly, without ceremony. Still, the questions remained. Why had Maria's attacker left her phone untouched? Why was there no DNA evidence under her nails? No clear defensive wounds? Who knew her route home well enough to strike at the precise moment she'd be alone? Not early, not late, but exactly when she passed the trail's midpoint? And perhaps most haunting, what was the significance of that shallow, deliberate cut on her wrist? It didn't bleed much. It wasn't lethal. But it seemed purposeful, intentional, and police never publicly addressed its meaning. Some saw it as symbolic. Others dismissed it as part of the struggle. But it remains a detail that doesn't quite fit. Over the years, a few glimmers of hope surfaced, brief flickers in an otherwise dark file. In 2013, an anonymous letter was sent to the local police department. It contained no return address. Inside was a single page with one sentence typed in block letters. "You looked in the wrong direction." No signature. No context. Authorities traced the envelope to a generic mailbox drop in a neighboring city. Nothing more came of it. In 2017, the case was quietly reviewed by a small cold case unit as part of a grant-funded initiative. They re-examined evidence using modern forensic tools, hoping that advancements in touch DNA or new cross-database matches might offer anything, to break the silence. But again, no hits. The case returned to the archive shelves, logged and boxed to this day. Maria Alves' murder remains unsolved. For her family, that fact is more than a statistic. It's a wound that never quite scabs over. Clara still places a candle in the window every October, the month her daughter was born and the month she died. A quiet flame for a daughter taken too soon. A symbol of hope, however dim, that someone someday might come forward with what they know, because someone does know. Someone saw something, or heard something, or remembers a detail they've buried under years of fear or forgetfulness. And until that person speaks, the case of Maria Alves will remain suspended, a story with no ending, a name with no justice. And maybe that's the most chilling part of all. Some stories don't fade. They echo in silence, in shadows, in unanswered questions. Thank you for spending this time with us as we reflected on the haunting and heartbreaking case of Maria Alves. If this is the first time you're hearing her name, you're not alone. Like so many forgotten stories, Maria's case faded quietly from headlines. But that doesn't mean it should be forgotten. If you've heard of this case before, or if something in her story stood out to you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes, even the smallest recollection can keep a cold case from going completely quiet. And if you find yourself drawn to quiet, haunting investigations like this one, stories that linger long after they're told, consider subscribing. We explore unsolved mysteries, overlooked crimes, and the lives of those caught in the shadows. No sensationalism, just the facts, the people, and the echoes they leave behind. Until next time, take care, and thank you for being here.